In 1980, global cinema received one of the most bizarre bombs ever dropped into theaters, Flash Gordon. It was an insane movie with outrageous hairstyles, blindingly bright skin-tight costumes, and an explosive soundtrack by the legendary band Queen. Flash Gordon felt like a colorful fever dream straight from the mind of a comic book-obsessed little boy. What if I told you that the on-screen hero who saved the universe actually fled the set before the movie even wrapped? That the heroic voice you hear didn't even belong to the lead actor? Or that this flashy spectacle was the accidental catalyst that birthed the multi-billion-dollar Star Wars empire? And it doesn't stop there. How did a movie brutally humiliated by American critics end up being quoted by the Queen of England herself? Today, fasten your seatbelts. We are about to fly into the eye of the storm to peel back the 20 craziest, most chaotic, and wildest facts about the production of Flash Gordon. Number 1. The leading man's escape and Hollywood's most spectacular deception. Let's kick things off with the movie's biggest shocker. The man wearing Flash Gordon's face actually had no voice. When notorious producer Dino De Laurentiis was tearing his hair out looking for a leading man, he happened to turn on the TV and saw Sam J. Jones on a dating game show. With his golden blonde hair, masculine square jaw, and the muscular physique of a former Marine, Jones was the perfect embodiment of the superhero ripped straight from the comic pages. But perfect looks couldn't cover up a behind-the-scenes disaster. Clashes erupted almost immediately between the young actor and the dictatorial Italian producer. The language barrier, deep creative differences, and an exhausting, physically draining shooting schedule turned the set into a powder keg. The breaking point hit during the holiday break. Jones reportedly got into a severe, real-life physical altercation, landing him in the hospital with facial injuries that severely derailed the shooting schedule. Although Jones eventually dragged himself back to finish filming his visual scenes, the working relationship was torn beyond repair. The moment the final cut echoed, Jones packed his bags, flat out refused to participate in the post-production automated dialogue replacement, ADR, skipped the entire press tour, and vanished without a goodbye. Backed into a corner with a silent movie, producer Dino had to play his trump card. He secretly hired an unknown voice actor, Peter Marinka, to dub over almost every single line of Flash Gordon's dialogue. Number 2. The birth of Star Wars from a brutal rejection. If you are a Star Wars fan, you owe Flash Gordon a massive thank you. In the early 1970s, long before the concepts of Jedi Knights or the Force ever existed, a young, unknown director named George Lucas desired only one thing in life. He wanted to make an epic cinematic adaptation of the Flash Gordon comic strips he had obsessed over since childhood. Boiling with passion, Lucas approached King Features Syndicate, the corporation holding the Flash Gordon rights, and pitched his ambitious idea. But reality threw a bucket of cold water in the young man's face. The rights holders looked down on Lucas. They demanded astronomical financial terms, strict creative control conditions, and ultimately, knowing Lucas was a nobody, they rejected him incredibly fast and ruthlessly. They opted to sell the rights to mogul Dino De Laurentiis, a man with much deeper pockets. Stripped of his childhood dream, Lucas left the office in absolute despair. But instead of giving up, he decided to turn that rage into creative fuel. If he couldn't make a movie about Flash Gordon, he would write his own space epic. He borrowed the structure of evil empires, desert planets, and spaceship dogfights, and invented the rebellion along with lightsabers. That bitter rejection from Flash Gordon didn't crush George Lucas. On the contrary, it accidentally forged the launchpad for the greatest cultural monument in cinematic history, Star Wars. Number 3. The director who was ruthlessly kicked to the curb. On paper, Flash Gordon was directed by Mike Hodges. However, the true power on set was a completely different story. Hodges wasn't even the first choice. He was hastily thrown into the project after director Nicholas Roeg walked away due to clashes with the producer. When he started working, Hodges wanted to approach the film from a more subtle angle. He aimed for a highly satirical piece, layered with dry British humor and an absurd but controlled tone. However, that artistic vision was completely out of sync with billionaire producer Dino De Laurentiis. Dino didn't care about subtlety. He just wanted the brightest, loudest, flashiest, and most megalomaniacal mess possible. Instead of having a massive blowout and firing the director, Dino chose a slow purge. Hodges was gradually stripped of all decision-making power on set. The producer unilaterally changed camera angles, and the script was altered without anyone bothering to inform him. The ultimate humiliation came during post-production. Hodges was completely locked out, uninvited from ever stepping foot inside the editing bay. There was no official termination letter, just a cold dismissal behind the velvet curtain. The movie hit theaters with Mike Hodges' name under the director credit, but in reality, it was a hybrid child, morphed so heavily that Hodges himself could barely recognize his own work. Number 4. The trash script, written minutes before shooting. To truly grasp the unprofessionalism of Flash Gordon, we have to look at how this movie was written. Lorenzo Semple Jr., the film's screenwriter, admitted he wrote the script with the explicit intention of making it a silly comedy. The problem was, producer Dino De Laurentiis, who wasn't exactly fluent in English, stubbornly insisted this was a serious epic. This tonal clash caused the script to be constantly ripped up and rewritten. When cameras started rolling, things were so chaotic that the script became worthless. New script pages, hastily scribbled by hand, were constantly being thrown at the cast by assistants just minutes before the cameras rolled. The actors had zero time to rehearse lines. Nobody knew what their character's psychological state was in the previous scene, and they were completely blind to what was going to happen next. Faced with this disaster, the cast decided to rebel. They just stopped reading the script. They started relying on instinct, making up lines, and improvising based on the emotion of the exact moment. Amazingly, that insane lack of organization bled onto the screen, creating an incredibly charming, campy atmosphere that became the very soul of the film. Number 5. The improvised American football match. The prime example of brilliant improvisation born from that disastrous script is the legendary football scene. In this sequence, Flash Gordon is cornered by the tyrant Ming's guards during an execution. To escape, he grabs something resembling an American football, which is actually an oval-shaped alien artifact, and turns the melee into an amateur, American-style scrimmage. This sequence is famous for being utterly ridiculous and hilariously absurd. But the truth is, there were absolutely no action storyboards drawn up for it. There was no professional martial arts choreographer involved, and there was absolutely zero stunt preparation. The director simply rolled the camera, and Sam J. Jones, who had played high school football, automatically tapped into his old skills. The actors playing the guards organically charged in like defensive linemen. They literally threw fake alien fruit at each other, tackled each other to the floor, and completely improvised the entire action sequence right in front of the lens. What should have been a martial arts disaster transformed into one of the goofiest yet most highly entertaining moments in sci-fi cinema history. Number 6. The missed masterpiece of legendary directors. We know how ridiculous Flash Gordon turned out to be, but you'll be shocked to learn this. During its inception, producer Dino had ambitions to turn it into the greatest, most profound and academic art film in the world. And to execute that ambition, he called up two of the most legendary directors in European cinema. The first was Federico Fellini, the Italian master of cinematic surrealism who had scooped up countless Oscars. The second was Sergio Leone, the king of the spaghetti western and the auteur behind the masterpiece The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The fascinating truth is that both of these great directors were massive fans of the Flash Gordon comic strips in their youth, and they actually considered taking the job. However, geniuses always have a razor-sharp intuition for disasters. After a few meetings, Fellini proactively backed out, using the excuse that he couldn't keep up with Hollywood's insane production pace. As for Sergio Leone, after reading the draft script and seeing Dino's flashy, bizarre, and unserious direction, he politely flat-out declined. Leone realized Dino didn't want to make art. He wanted to run a circus. The fact that these two legends stepped back just in time saved their reputations, simultaneously condemning Flash Gordon to slide down the path of becoming a classic trash comedy. Number 7. The hilarious auditions of Kurt Russell and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Before handing the movie's fate to unknown Marine Sam J. Jones, the audition list for the character of Flash Gordon was basically a directory of 1980s A-list stars. However, it played out like a comedy sketch. Kurt Russell was the first to get the red carpet invitation from the producers, but Russell, after flipping through a few pages of the script, tossed it aside and bluntly refused, stating the story was too stupid and insulting to his intelligence. Next, the legendary Dennis Hopper was targeted, but his gritty, eccentric acting style completely clashed with the vibe of a simple-minded, muscle-bound hero. The funniest case was Arnold Schwarzenegger. At that time, the Terminator was still a bodybuilder struggling to find his footing in Hollywood. Arnold's bulging physique was perfect for the role, but the producers ruthlessly cut him after he opened his mouth just once. The reason? His thick Austrian accent was so heavy that absolutely no one in the casting room could understand what kind of English he was speaking. Ironically, they rejected Arnold over a voice issue, only to end up casting Sam J. Jones, a guy who eventually had his voice completely wiped out in dubbing anyway. Number 8. The utter terror of art house icon, Max von Sydow. Max von Sydow was no ordinary actor. In the 70s, he was considered a god of European art house cinema. He was famous for incredibly heavy psychological roles, from the knight playing chess with death in The Seventh Seal to the legendary exorcist priest in The Exorcist. Therefore, when the press release confirmed he would be playing Ming the Merciless in Flash Gordon, the entire film criticism world was in severe shock. They couldn't understand why an acting monument would stoop to playing a comic book adaptation meant for children. Max von Sydow himself was equally bewildered. When he strapped on the gaudy red silk costume, stood in front of vibrantly colored backdrops, and delivered highly theatrical and exaggerated lines, he suffered through deep crises of self-doubt. He was utterly terrified that this cheap, ridiculous role would completely obliterate the serious artistic legacy and reputation he had spent his life building. He would frequently whisper to his co-stars, "Are we making a spoof movie?" Yet, this insane gamble yielded an unimaginable victory. When the film premiered, Max von Sydow's absolute deadpan seriousness while playing an absurd role accidentally generated a bizarre magnetism. Audiences went wild for the ruthless yet aristocratic demeanor of Tyrant Ming. The role he thought would destroy his career ultimately became his most iconic villainous character, echoing his name far and wide in pop culture. Number 9. The fashion disaster, powered by duct tape. On screen, the Kingdom of Mongo appears with magnificent, unparalleled luxury, blinding gold armor, the giant angelic wings of the Hawkman, and intricately beaded dresses. But if you had the chance to stand on set and look closely at those costumes, you'd realize the pathetic lie of cinema. The truth is, the wardrobe department was pushed to the point of exhaustion, and massive budget cuts meant the material quality was atrocious. The armor that looked like solid metal was actually made of cheap, thin plastic, and it constantly cracked and shattered after every action scene. The Hawkman's wings were heavy, brittle, and frequently ripped to shreds. Zippers on the actors' clothes would burst open constantly right while the cameras were rolling. But facing the pressure of burning money by the minute on set, the director issued martial law. No stopping allowed. A helmet fell off? Just pick it up and keep acting. Armor cracked? The costume crew would rush in, use thick rolls of duct tape to frantically wrap around the cracks, tape the broken wings back together right in front of the lens, and yell, "Action!" to keep going. Most of the dazzling perfection you see in the final cut is purely the miracle of deceptive camera angles, lighting tricks, and hundreds of rolls of duct tape cleverly hidden behind the actors' backs. Number 10. The actor who made his own sound effects with his mouth. We'll wrap up the first half of the script with one of the funniest and most hilariously immature stories to ever happen in Hollywood. British actor Brian Blessed, who played Prince Vultan, the leader of the Hawkmen, is a man of colossal energy. He didn't just act, he fully immersed himself and went wild with his role, exactly like a 5-year-old boy given a new toy. His excitement became an absolute disaster for the audio recording team. During intense battle scenes with laser guns and swords, instead of just swinging his weapon so the post-production team could add the sounds later, Brian Blessed continuously made his own sound effects with his mouth. While fighting, he kept yelling, "Pew, pew, zap, bang," every time he shot a gun, and made pow, whack noises whenever he threw a punch. The sound crew was in utter despair. The director had to cut the scene multiple times, pull Brian Blessed aside, and beg him to shut his mouth while fighting so the machines could do their job. But all efforts were in vain. His excitement was too massive. He would scream his epic lines and then habitually follow them up with a few vocal laser blasts. The consequence? The production crew had to waste piles of extra money and time dragging the actor into an ADR studio to re-record all his dialogue for those scenes, just to clean up the mess of DIY gunfire sounds he had made. Number 11. The terrifying cable car accident. In the cinematic world of the 1980s, computer-generated imagery was a primitive, luxurious concept. Therefore, to shoot the Hawkman soaring through the sky, actors genuinely had to hang suspended from flimsy wire cables dozens of meters above the ground. Actor Brian Blessed, playing Prince Vultan, was an incredibly stubborn man. Despite his massive frame and having to wear fiberglass prop wings weighing nearly 40 pounds, he vehemently refused to use a stunt double. He wanted to perform all the dangerous stunts himself to deliver the most authentic feel. But that recklessness almost cost him his life. During a complex flying sequence, the pressure from his body weight and the giant wings exceeded the load limit. A deafening snap echoed, and the steel cable severed completely. Brian Blessed's massive body went into a freefall straight down toward the rock-hard studio floor from a lethal height. There were absolutely no safety nets or crash mats prepared underneath. The entire set held its breath, certain they had just witnessed a fatal accident. Yet, by some miracle, or perhaps thanks to his thick layers of fat and muscle, Blessed survived. In fact, instead of suing the studio or demanding time off, he scrambled to his feet, dusted himself off, let out a massive laugh, and bravely demanded the tech crew rig a new cable so he could climb back up and shoot it again immediately. Number 12. The flooded set, electrocution, and keep rolling. If the cable snap wasn't enough to show the insanity of Flash Gordon's production, this flood disaster will definitely have you shaking your head. Midway through filming at Elstree Studios in London, a system failure caused a main water pipe to burst open. Thousands of cubic feet of murky water came gushing out, turning the extravagant palace set into a massive swimming pool. The papier-mâché and wooden props got soaked, waterlogged, and began to disintegrate. Even more terrifying, the tangled electrical wiring from hundreds of high-voltage studio lights was sitting submerged in the water, creating a lethal electrocution hazard for the crew at any given second. Any sane director or producer would have immediately evacuated the set and called for maintenance. But this is Flash Gordon. Operating on the "we're burning money every second" mindset, the director and producer ordered, "Keep the cameras rolling." They ignored the rising water at their feet and continued directing the actors to wade through the flood to shoot. There's even an entire scene where guards slip and fall on the flooded floor that made it straight into the final theatrical cut, which the producer casually dismissed as a natural visual effect. On this movie, chaos was never a problem. It was recycled into the plan. Number 13. Bring Me the Queens. Initially, studio executives targeted the band Pink Floyd, who had just released the masterpiece The Dark Side of the Moon. However, producer Dino De Laurentiis brushed it off. Simply put, he was an older Italian man who was completely clueless about contemporary pop culture and had no idea who the hell Pink Floyd was. Later, an assistant took a massive risk and played a vinyl record by the band Queen for Dino to hear. Exactly 10 seconds after the melody kicked in, Dino slammed his fist on the table and ordered in his broken English, even getting the band's name wrong. "Bring the Queens to me," Receiving the invitation, Queen had an incredibly short window of just a few weeks to compose the entire soundtrack while they were bogged down with a world tour schedule. With no professional studio time, they had to write music on their tour bus, brainstorm ideas in hotel rooms, and record in flashes between sold-out shows. The rush, the wildness, and the natural genius of Freddie Mercury and Brian May birthed an explosive soundtrack masterpiece that salvaged the film's visually absurd elements. Number 14. The censorship scissors and the tyrant's underlying violence. Despite its colorful and comedic wrapper, Flash Gordon contained dark undertones that made film censorship boards around the world sweat bullets. Audiences at the time might have brushed it off, but Tyrant Ming's threats toward the female lead, Dale Arden, carried an unsettling level of realism. Ming wasn't just a villain who wanted to conquer the world. The way he psychologically manipulated her, his coercion, and his lustful gaze while forcing Dale Arden to be his concubine carried a heavy undertone of covert psychological violence. For a movie stamped with a family-friendly rating in 1980, this sexual tension was a censorship minefield. In countries with conservative traditions like Ireland, the scenes in Ming's bedroom and the torture of Flash Gordon were immediately red-flagged by the board. They issued an ultimatum: either cleanly snip out those lustful, threatening glares, or the film gets banned entirely from theaters. Number 15. The blanket ban, due to occultism and black magic. In countries like Malaysia and Singapore in the early 80s, films were scrutinized incredibly harshly through a cultural lens. When the censorship boards watched Flash Gordon, they didn't see absurd, campy humor. What they saw were bizarre concentric circle patterns, dark ceremonial robes bearing skull motifs, and strange incantations muttered by Ming's priests during sacrificial rituals. Local authorities deemed the movie was secretly propagating occult culture, human sacrifice, and black magic, elements considered taboo and likely to corrupt the youth. As a result, Flash Gordon triggered a fierce wave of boycotts from conservative organizations. The film was completely banned in some regions, or butchered so tragically that local audiences went to the theater and couldn't even comprehend what the plot was about. Number 16. The legendary artist's fury. For Flash Gordon to become an icon, it needed a shape. Although the character was created by Alex Raymond in 1934, it was the renowned illustrator Al Williamson who defined and breathed life into this universe in the comic strips of the following decades. Williamson drew a Flash Gordon with an elegant, dramatic style and sharp lines, heavily imbued with the nobility of the space epic genre. He viewed his work as serious art. When he heard Hollywood was adapting the comic, Williamson had incredibly high hopes. He was invited to an exclusive VIP screening. But when the first frames hit the screen, those hopes instantly shattered into 1,000 pieces. Instead of a grand masterpiece, he was forced to witness a gaudy circus, bland comedic dialogue, and actors wearing plastic armor patched with duct tape. The pain and disappointment of an artist seeing his child turned into a joke was so massive that, barely halfway through the film, Al Williamson stood up, walked out of the theater in dead silence, and never looked back. He quietly disowned the film, cutting off all ties and refusing to acknowledge the existence of this adaptation for the rest of his life. Number 17. The disastrous box office wipeout in America. The box office failure of Flash Gordon in the US is an expensive lesson in missing the mark. As mentioned, producer Dino De Laurentiis barely read the English script. He greenlit the project purely on visual intuition. He assumed American audiences were starving for sci-fi after the success of Star Wars. But he was dead wrong. When American audiences walked into theaters in 1980, they expected to see a serious, philosophical film with cutting-edge George Lucas-style special effects. Instead, they had a brightly colored disco acid trip thrown in their faces, featuring situations so absurd they defied logic. American audiences at the time felt massively let down. They didn't grasp the movie's underlying satirical nature, assuming it was simply trashy, sloppily made, and poorly acted. A terrible wave of word of mouth killed the movie in its second week of release. North American revenues nosedived tragically, causing the studio to take a massive loss, and Flash Gordon was quickly shoved into the shadows of obscurity. Number 18. The brilliant rebirth and comeback in the UK. If America turned its back on Flash Gordon, the UK opened its arms wide to embrace it. When the film crossed the Atlantic to premiere in the UK, a bizarre cultural phenomenon occurred. The movie that tanked in America became an explosive box office smash in the British Isles. The reason for this dramatic comeback lies in cultural DNA. British audiences have a long-standing tradition of pantomime theatre, a theatrical genre that relies on exaggeration, gaudiness, over-the-top villains, and loud, direct interaction with the audience. When the British watched Flash Gordon, they instantly tuned in to the film's frequency. They understood that this wasn't a serious epic. This was a grand joke, a space pantomime. Furthermore, the use of a soundtrack by their national treasure, the band Queen, stoked national pride. British audiences went wild, clapping thunderously in theatres, turning Flash Gordon into a dazzling cultural icon, a classic piece of cinema that has been broadcast on British television every Christmas for the past 40 years. Number 19. The most powerful fan, named the Queen of England. Britain's fanaticism for Flash Gordon didn't just stop at the working class, it penetrated deep into the halls of Buckingham Palace. In 2020, actor Brian Blessed revealed an earth-shattering secret that left the media utterly floored. During a royal investiture ceremony, Queen Elizabeth II personally broke formal protocol, leaned close to his ear, and whispered a confession. She was a massive fan of the movie Flash Gordon. The Queen shared that she absolutely adored the silliness and vibrancy of the film, and it had become an indispensable tradition. She frequently played the VHS tape of the movie to watch with the princes, princesses, and her great-grandchildren during holidays at Balmoral Castle. In fact, the most powerful monarch in the world specifically requested Brian Blessed to shout his iconic line, "Gordon's alive," right in front of her. This surreal truth proves that sometimes pure absurdity has the power to unite even those with royal blood. Number 20. The blueprint that inspired a generation of billion-dollar directors. You can laugh at Flash Gordon, critics can tear it apart, but cinematic history honors it as a great trailblazer. By rejecting every cliché framework and boldly smashing aesthetic rules to pursue vibrant insanity, the film became an invisible permission slip, unleashing creativity for an entire generation of future filmmakers. Decades later, the little boys who sat watching Flash Gordon on TV grew up to become some of the most powerful directors in Hollywood. Director Edgar Wright called it a masterpiece that deeply influenced his visual thinking. Taika Waititi essentially copy-pasted the vibrant color palette, the absurdity, and the driving rock soundtrack of Flash Gordon straight into the blockbuster Thor Ragnarok, 2017. But the greatest successor has to be James Gunn. When making Guardians of the Galaxy, James Gunn admitted he drew direct inspiration from Flash Gordon's blend of rock and roll, satire, and rogue heroes to mold Marvel's billion-dollar universe. The remnants of that colorful flying car from years ago are now shining brighter than ever in the sky of modern cinema. Out of these 20 earth-shattering facts, which detail blew your mind the most? Does knowing the lead actor was stripped of his voice, or that the Queen of England was a die-hard fan, change the way you look at this movie? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so I can continue churning out scripts exposing the truths behind the greatest cinematic blockbusters. See you guys in the next video.